So, lastly, I want to begin the discussion, at least briefly, about how media can also be a form of decolonization, especially in terms of aesthetics or just as a creative space for Indigenous peoples to assert their own knowledge systems. So, I want to begin this analysis of decolonization through media through an analysis of NDN memes. And I will give examples of specific TikTok videos and accounts later in this video section. But for right now, I'm just going to focus on a broad analysis of how Indian meme makers and digital creators are producers of decolonial knowledge production. I don't want to limit understandings of Indigenous digital media to their use by non Indigenous communities either. I want to be sure to highlight both how memes represent Indigenous space and time in digital worlds, wherein Indigenous peoples are actually refusing the colonial institutions that subjugate them and finding Indigenous joy and solace among each other. So, a very purist definition of decolonization as a form of act or a methodology or a method or something you enact in the world is often taken from the scholar Linda Tuhuwai Smith and her seminal work, Decolonizing Methodologies. And her and many Indigenous studies scholars have argued that Indigenous peoples produce forms of knowledge within and without colonial institutions that do constitute modes of decolonization. And so, modes of decolonization against this rhetoric of enlightenment and knowledge and coloniality that we were discussing earlier in the lecture. Decolonial knowledge production is happening outside of the academy in visual and literary spaces inhabited by Indigenous digital creators. But as we've discussed, even decolonization theory, led by scholars such as Walter D. Mignolo and Anibal Kunjabo, seeks recognition from the colonial institutions that have historically excluded the knowledges of Black, Indigenous, and racialized peoples. So, what are the forms of digital media that we can look to that can help us harness the knowledges of Indigenous peoples that have been kept without the institution because of this narrative of the vanishing Indian that has so inscribed itself on the colonial record? So, what are accessible forms of Indigenous digital media that can provide an initial imaginary for the Indigenous future, one grounded in processes of communal and self transformation, defined through accessible modes of expression and devised through collaborative methods? For Indigenous peoples, digital media and technology are spaces to build Indigenous networks and to future decolonial worlds through the world building impulse to build kinship and to share intimate content. Indigenous media is an avenue for change and one that offers new insight into pressing social issues affecting Indigenous communities and Canadian society broadly. Indigenous knowledge systems can be applied in the fields of digital imaging and technology to create a future imaginary for Indigenous peoples and their communities. And one example of this is so called Indian memes on TikTok. What's interesting about TikToks is they rely on a combination of visual and narrative story. And story is a very important component of all Indigenous knowledge systems. For Indigenous peoples who reside in what is now Canada, story and stories are modes of embodied sovereignty, knowledge production, ecology, and healing. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has shown how testimony, in particular, is an important decolonial act that heals colonial trauma within Indigenous communities by supporting mutual recognition between Indigenous peoples who represent survivors of colonial and settler colonial state led and intimate violence. By creating Indian memes, Indigenous youth use a blend of visual narrative, historical trope, humor, and storytelling to make digital creations that are decolonial interventions on canonic literatures and visual culture. Sometimes these NDN or Indigenous youth TikTok accounts and the memeing sounds that they will use will discuss real policy issues that are affecting their communities and even insider knowledge about how Indigenous peoples view policymakers like Justin Trudeau and the Liberals, and perhaps their perspective of the void promises that came along with the narrative of reconciliation they were sold by Trudeau's Liberals.
I'm in the ghetto. Ra-ta-ta-ta. Ra-ta-ta-ta.
And sometimes they're not as serious. Sometimes they are just depictions of Indigenous joy. They're depictions of young Indigenous women finding closeness and solidarity and laughter together. And these special kind of belly laughs that come only when you are with another Indigenous sister. So, in these ways, they do represent forms of inside humor that really are just a space by and for Indigenous peoples. And in this way, Indian TikToks and other Indian forms of meme culture, they are a form of refusal against the normative cultures that have been defined by predominantly white settler communities that are surrounding the indigenous communities who are creating this content.
You know you're native when your friends laugh like this. God, just rowdy, really hitting each other, throwing themselves back and forth, all loud. Don't even know what they're laughing about, but they're just happy, these girls.
And these pockets of solace found online in spaces like TikTok or other digital spaces that we'll explore throughout this course, they also provide a space for what I like to call the marginalized within marginalized community. So, within Indigenous communities, for instance, we can think of this to be the queer and trans Indigenous peoples who experience heteronormative or transnormative forms of pushing out from within Indigenous communities, even though with the George Catlin painting, we can see that there was a history of reverence towards Two Spirit peoples in many communities. And perhaps this next video that I'm going to show will be a beautiful symbiosis to bring back the voices of the Two Spirit peoples who have been systematically pushed out of Indigenous communities or even Canadian knowledge producing communities. And I think that the spirit of these peoples is resurging today in our Two Spirit youth who are continuing to live authentically and be themselves unabashedly.